Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be showing how to paint a Night Lord's Terminator. Here's a quick list of the paints that we'll be using in this tutorial. So I'm going to get on with the armour first, and as you can see here, I've already base coated this using Night Lord's Blue. For the shade, I made a 50-50 mix of Night Lord's Blue and Black and carefully dropped this into the recesses. Although I'm applying this fairly neatly into the recess to begin with, as I would normally treat any Space Marine armour, I later decided I wanted a much more contrasted look, so I went on to apply this shading as a glaze towards the bottom of each of the panels. The Night Lord's Blue paint is already a very dark and rich colour, which made this shading very forgiving, and as you'll see later on, tidying up any tide marks or uneven shading can easily be done by glazing back with the base coat. Here I'm just applying the shade inside where the head will be. This area would naturally be in shade, and it's much easier to apply this before gluing the head in. It will also help the head to stand out once we get it all highlighted. So you might find that you need to build up this shading over a few thin layers before you reach the amount of contrast that you want. I think for me it took around 2 to 3 thin glazes to get it to where I was happy. Although glazing takes a little while, the coats are very thin and it should dry reasonably fast. I keep moving around the miniature and coming back to these areas once they're dry. Now, as I mentioned previously, once this shading was done, I decided to go back in with the Night Lord's Blue and quickly tidy up any uneven shading. The next step here was to apply the first stage highlight using Kantor Blue. Now this is quite a subtle first stage, so if you're doing this for an army, I would probably stick to doing a normal chunky edge highlight as you would with any other Space Marine armour. However, for this I wanted a more blended look, so I thinned down the Kantor, applying it as a glaze towards the top of the panels, while still applying it as a chunky highlight towards the bottom facing edges. We can use this stage to start to get an idea of where our light placement will be, as it's really easy just to go back over with the base coat if it's not working. I tend to find that I spend the majority of my time on a miniature just getting these first 3 stages neat, as it provides a good foundation to place the subsequent highlights. For the next stage highlight I used Altdorf Guard Blue. Later on I used this stage as a glaze as well, however for now I'm just going to apply it as a finer edge highlight around all of the edges of the armour and under the trim. So along the top of the arms here, I'm glazing the highlight out a bit wider than usual, as I eventually want to build up a softer highlight on this area. Of course, where it's safe to do so, you can use the side of the brush, like along the top of the Terminator armor here. Now, like I was saying earlier, I wanted a much more contrasted look than I would normally go for, so at this stage I took some very thin down Altdorf guard blue and glazed this towards the top of the panels. I go on to pick out some reflection spots later on using the same glaze. Again, you can glaze back here with the Kantor if it starts to look a bit too chalky, or if you've taken the glaze a bit too far. This is not something I would really normally do for a rank and file miniature, but for a showcase model or just to pick out a few reflections here and there on the armor, it really helps to add some interest to the model. So apologies for being slightly off center here with the camera, but hopefully you can still see the process. I'm just building up a specular highlight on the top of the shoulder pad, and this is with the same glaze consistency paint. So it takes a couple of layers until I built up to an opaque highlight in the center. Then once that's done, I glazed around the outside with a very thin down Kantor blue to further smooth out the transition. Now for the next stage highlight here, I made a mix of around 50-50 Altdorf guard blue and Fenrisian Grey. Now you can go all the way up to pure Fenrisian on the uppermost edges, but I avoided using it too much as I wanted the transitions to be less noticeable. Again, I'm using the side of the brush here to help me in a few places where the miniature is sharp enough. For the highlights next to the trim, it can often be difficult to achieve a fine consistent line, so if you struggle with this, it can be helpful to do it slightly chunkier and then cut back in with the black on the trim. Then when we come to base coat the trim, we will be left with a nice black line separating the two. Now, using the same highlight stage, I continue to build up these specular highlights. These areas take a little bit of time to get smooth, and as you can see, I've sped up the video quite a bit here, but they're nice little final touches that really help to add interest to the model and help to make the armor pop. I plan to cover this technique in a future video, however you can see that using a light stippling motion with this glaze consistency paint can really help to get a smooth transition. This combined with regular glazing of the Kantor stage around the outside of the highlight results in a very smooth finish. I continue to highlight the rest of the armor and head using the previous stages. Now it's time to paint the lightning effect, and I started off here with a 50-50 mix of Kantor and Altdorf Guard Blue. I have to admit this was the one thing that had previously deterred me from painting Night Lords, and surprisingly it's actually very simple, although it takes a little practice to get the shapes of the lightning to look convincing enough, and it took me a few attempts to get the result I was happy with. I found what worked best is to first paint in a central trunk, almost like a tree or a root system, then painting finer branches coming out from it. As you can see, real lightning looks very random in the way that it forms. There are curves as well as sharper zigzags. Now this first attempt on the axe had some good bits and they were looking quite nice, highlighting towards the middle of the lightning by adding Fenrisian into the mix and then picking out some really fine spots of white where it branched or intersected made it really work. However, I think overall it started to look almost a bit like lava or a mesh, and it didn't really look natural enough. So I tried to improve on this pattern with the leg panel next, being a bit bolder with the design and trying not to make the previous mesh pattern, and I feel like this worked much better now. Personally, I'm not a fan of overusing the effect across the whole of the Night Lord's armor, and instead picking out a few random panels to showcase the lightning is more to my taste, and it also takes much less time. Finally, I picked out some hotspots again on the lightning by adding white into the Fenrisian, and then the effect is complete. Now it was time to paint the brass or bronze trim, and for this I applied a few thin coats of Castellax bronze until I built up a solid base coat. Once that was dry, I layered over with Runelord brass, leaving the Castellax in the shade. Next, it was time to shade the brass. I wanted to get a very dull and dirty patina to this brass, and I found that the contrast paint Guilliman Flesh gave a nice warmth to the shading whilst also matting and dulling down the shine a bit. I applied this thin down with water with a couple of coats. You could also use something like Reikland Flesh Shade if you have that instead. However, it's a bit less concentrated and can also sometimes go a bit too glossy. If you wanted to deepen the shading a bit further here, you could also use a small amount of Agrax Earthshade. Once the shading was dry, I started to highlight it by adding Vallejo Modeler Silver into the Runelord brass. I like to save using the pure silver only for the sharpest edges and rivets. So that was pretty much it for the brass. You can push the shading a little deeper in places around the rivets with some Doomball brown and black, and then pick out the rivets with silver. Unfortunately, I lost the footage for this, but hopefully you get the idea. I then went on to add some more specular highlights to the blue armour. When it comes to working in sub-assemblies, it can be useful to leave doing things like specular highlights until you've glued the part in place, as it's much easier to work out the direction of the light. Many times I've been painting something and later come to realise that the highlights are at the wrong angle, so I've had to go back in and correct it, and it's just one of the slight issues with painting parts separately. Next I went on to paint the Loin Cloth, and for this I wanted something in keeping with the grim nature of Chaos and the Night Lords, so of course it had to be made from skin. I've been enjoying using my Rakarth substitute mix since the Skaven video. It's a really nice desaturated and dead looking skin recipe. You could of course use Rakarth instead, however this recipe is much smoother and nicer to work with. After the base coat was dry, I started to add some shading. For this I used a mix of Gorthor brown and Khorne red, and then glazed this into the folds. You could also add a little Screamer pink or Doomball brown into the mix here, depending on how pink or brown you want the shading to be. All of these will work nicely. I started to add more of the Khorne red towards the bottom of the cloth to help it look more like a bloody and bruised flesh, deepening the shading by adding tiny amounts of black into the Khorne red. Once I was happy with that, I went back and tidied the raised areas with the base coat again, and then deepened the shade in a couple of places with some Khorne red and black. I began to highlight the loincloth by adding Greyseer into the Rakarth flesh and applying this along the raised folds. Lastly, I added some AK White into the Greyseer for the final few highlights. I decided to add some interest to the loincloth with a couple of chaosy runes carved into the flesh. The chaos transfer sheet that comes with these terminators has some good reference for this. I picked out the runes first using Khorne red. Again, you can glaze around them to create a bruised look and even apply a few streaks to look like blood drips. Adding a small amount of black again into the Khorne and then painting that inside of the design helps to make it look like dried blood. Finally, I applied some very fine highlights using Greyseer around the edges of the design. It really helps to sell the look that these runes are carved into the flesh. That's it for this video, guys. Here's the completed miniature. The eyes were painted the same as the Ultramarines video, so check out that for some useful tips. I will save all the smaller chaosy details for a future video, so let me know if you're interested in that, as well as the basing. I hope you enjoyed this one, everyone. The next video will be Skaven Part 2 and followed by Golden Demon content next month. A massive thank you to all the patrons for your continued support.